going to take a first look at the all-new 100 megapixel Hasselblad 907X with the all-new CFV100C back. There are a lot of really nice upgrades to this camera now, including the 100 megapixel backside illuminated sensor from the X2D. We also now have phase detection autofocus, as well as 1 terabyte of internal SSD storage. This is certainly one of the most unique cameras that you can currently find, and if image quality is important to you, this complements the X2D as one of the best cameras you can currently shoot with. So welcome back, everyone. This is the brand new Hasselblad 907X with the 100 megapixel back. Many of you may remember a couple years ago when the 50 megapixel version of this came out. I did a review on that, and I really was impressed with this camera. It's one of the most unique form factors that you're going to find anywhere. I actually bought one, and I've been using it ever since, and I absolutely love this camera, particularly in a studio environment. We'll get into use cases in a bit, but I want to talk about what's new in the 100 megapixel version. So this camera features the same 100 megapixel sensor that you find on the X2D. That is currently, I think, one of the best sensors ever made. It's backside illuminated. You get up to 15 stops of dynamic range. It delivers 16-bit files. It really is gorgeous. It's amazing to work with, and I can't think of any camera that gives you a better sensor and processor combination. The Hasselblad X2D just delivers, and I have noticed in my time with the 907X with the 100 megapixel back that it is no different. It is absolutely outstanding. Now, I also mentioned one of the things that I love about this camera is the form factor. So it certainly is a very vintage aesthetic. It has a nod back to the original 500cm cameras that Hasselblad used to make, and it follows that same direction. You've got a chrome body with the leatherette. It looks really cool. It is very different to shoot with, and I think that's one of the things that I absolutely love about this. It's so different than anything else on the market, and I think that's what makes it really cool. So the controls on this camera are fairly minimal. We have one button that is your lens release, and then on the other side we have a combination of a shutter release with a ring around it. Now, the way this works, depending on what mode you're in, is you essentially have 2 functions from this ring. So for instance, if you're in manual mode, the default is this ring will control the aperture. Now, on the side of the camera, there is a small button. When I push this button, it acts as an alternative function for that ring. So if I push and hold this button and then turn the ring, it turns into my shutter speed. And so this will change a little bit depending on what mode you're shooting in. So for instance, if you're in aperture priority, it is aperture, and then with the secondary function button, it becomes exposure compensation. And the same with shutter priority, where it's going to control the shutter speed, so on and so forth. So it's a really cool way of being able to control the camera with very minimal dials on the body itself. The back of the camera features a touch screen, and below that there are 5 physical buttons that will control various things like turning on the camera, going into image review mode, being able to delete an image, so on and so forth. Everything else, though, is pretty much done on the back of the camera as a touchscreen. Now, I also want to mention that this is probably one of my favorite user interfaces of any camera system. The whole thing is touch-based. It's also icon-based, so it's got an incredibly awesome UI. And just to give you an overview, when you boot up the camera, it's going to default into live view. You do have some touch control over here. So for instance, on the top left, I can select my white balance. If I go over on the top right, I can select the ISO setting that I want to use. Now, there are some other modes that you can get into, and you can use the physical buttons, but the easiest way to do this is you can swipe down, and this will get you into the function menu. I can select aperture, shutter speed. On the top row, you're going to see white balance, as we saw before. There's also autofocus modes. I can select between autofocus and manual focus, and then also new on this camera, because we now have phase detection autofocus, we have face detection autofocus as well. And so if I click this little icon here, I have 3 selections. I can go between auto, manual, or I can turn it off. When it is on, what it will do is it will detect faces in the scene. That's where the autofocus priority will be. And so what it does is it draws a little green box around the face. One thing I mentioned is alongside the X2D, in my experience with this, even though it's not eye detection autofocus, it is putting an emphasis on the eyes, and it is recognizing faces with an eye priority when you are shooting. So that's one thing to consider, even though you're not seeing it in the UI. That's the experience that I'm having with this. I have had no focus problems at all, especially when shooting portraits. On the bottom row, I've got exposure mode, and we've got the conventional manual, aperture, shutter, or program priority modes. Next to that, we have the metering method, so you can choose between center weighted spot or even center spot metering. We've got drive mode selection, and this camera will do both exposure bracketing as well as focus bracketing, which is very cool. Now, if I want to dig deeper into the customization of this camera, there is a second page here. And so if I swipe to the left, you're going to get that second page. Everything is icon based. So if I have something that I'm looking for, it's really easy to find. They have had this icon based system since since the original X1D. It's on the H cameras also. This is one of my favorites ever because it makes everything really easy to find. And they've simplified it over the years, and I think along with the X2D, this is the same menu system. It is absolutely incredible. On the right side of the camera, we have a door that opens, which will reveal the battery and also your CF Express card slot. This camera did move up from using SD cards. The other thing worth pointing out here is that it is a one-slot design, but the camera does have 1 terabyte of internal SSD storage. One of the things that I love about this is, first of all, if you are like me and you're one of the people who forgets to take their card out of the reader and put it back into the camera sometimes, you're covered because you have a backup of external storage. The truth is I actually never take the card out of the camera because I will plug this in using the high-speed USB port over here, and as long as you're using the right cable on here and it supports the data transfer speeds, this is the fastest way to get a lot of high megapixel images off of your camera and onto your computer. And I want to say that there are only 2 cameras in existence right now that are using internal SSD storage. This is something that every manufacturer should be doing right now. Now, on the bottom of the camera, next to where you see the tripod socket connections, you're also going to see the connection port that is going to connect to the optional grip. And what's really cool about this, just screws in with the small thumb screw here, and once I have that set, you've got a control grip, which is going to give you more support to the camera, and also this gives you more functionality in terms of physical buttons. This is actually something that I highly recommend for this camera because I love the simplicity and I love the option of being able just to use the camera on its own, but the optional grip is going to give you more control over autofocus points. So for instance, if you want to use the joystick to move the autofocus point around, if you want to do things like be able to pull up the menus really quickly, or a lot of times I will keep this in manual focus and I set it up for back button autofocus. The only way to do that is with the optional control grip. And it does give you some more functionality too. You get 2 physical dials here, and the joystick also pushes in for another custom functionality. It's really well thought out, and I think that even though it comes as an option to this camera, I think it's something that I would highly recommend if you want to get into this system. On the back of the camera, you also have this small door that comes down, and underneath you're going to find your flash connections as well as your remote release connection. Hasselblad make a remote release for this camera, which is something that's very cool, and if you have this on a tripod, you're doing long exposure and you want to do remote release. Previously with the X2D, the only way to do that is by using the app, and which is very good, but if you want to do it with a physical connection, you can actually get that exposure release and plug it in there. I want to talk about flash for a second because there's something very new on this camera, and I think this is a good time to mention the modular concept that we have here. So to illustrate, this is probably a good time to bring out one of my old film Hasselblad. So this is my old 503CX. I love this camera. The cool thing about Hasselblad with these early designs is they were completely modular, and what I mean by that is the camera is here. You've got the lens, you've got the camera body with the viewfinder. There's a mirror inside so I can focus using the viewfinder, and then finally you've got the backs. Now the backs are removable, so if I just basically slide this over, I can take the back off. Now, why would you want to change the backs in and out? Well, let's say you're in a studio situation and I have this mounted to a tripod. I can simply change the backs in and out very easily without having to disturb the setup. And so that's one thing that's really cool, especially back in the film days where you basically got 12 shots to a back. There is a 24 shot back, but still it's fairly limited. Also, you can actually take the film off of the camera and replace it with a different film type. So let's say you have 2 or 3 of these backs. I have one with color film that's slide film. I have one that's C41, and then I have another that's black and white, so I can change these in and out as I go. It also offered different options for different viewfinders. I can actually take this viewfinder out. It becomes modular. Obviously, most people are familiar with the concept of being able to change the lens out, but this lets you change various items on the camera itself out, and it's very cool. Now, Hasselblad have brought that over with the 907X concept as well. So it's similar to the film camera, except we don't have a mirror box in here, and we have a digital back instead of a film back, but you're going to see the release button on the top there, just as it is on my older camera. And so if I push this in and slide it to the right, I can actually take the back and separate it from the body of the camera. This is crazy talk, Ted. Why on earth would you want to do that? Well, the first thing we can do is we can actually mount up the new hot shoe that Hasselblad has designed to go with this camera. So if you want to shoot flash photography and you don't want to use the little small inputs, you want a more traditional hot shoe, this one does ship with a hot shoe that you can put in. So there's a little cover over here, and you're going to slide this off. You can see the connection port down here, and you're going to actually slide in the hot shoe assembly, and then you're going to put the camera back together, and now we have a camera with a hot shoe on the top. Now, another thing that I can do is I can take my film camera, and I'm going to remove the film back on here, and I'm going to replace it with the digital back, 100 megapixels, and it mounts to the film body here, and I now have a digital 503CX. So this is really cool. Now, obviously, a couple things you need to know about this. We've got the digital back mounted on here, and there's a certain way that we're going to use this. It is not a square format sensor, and it is definitely not as big as the film area was with medium format film. Now, this camera does come with a little mask that you can drop in so you know where your crop areas are, but it works really well. What I love about this, it's come a long way since Hasselblad's first started doing this on the 50 megapixel version of this camera, but essentially it does recognize the camera body. I have this already set up. If you're using a different Hasselblad body and you want to note that, what I'm going to do is just slide over to the secondary menu here, and you can click on camera body, and there is a little drop down menu, and you can select what it is that you're using there. And I'm pretty much good to go. So we're going to go back over to the first menu. Basically, the only control I have on the actual back now is going to be the live view. I can turn that on or off. And so if you just want to preview the scene, get your focus situated and all that, you can go in there. But everything else is going to be controlled from the camera. So really, it does not change the experience from shooting with a film camera. Now I just have a digital back. It is very cool. Now, there are some other things that this back is very useful for as well. So Hasselblad do sell adapters, and with the appropriate adapters, you can use the H series lenses, for instance, so all of the HC or HCD lenses, and you can also adapt all of the X-Pan series lenses. So if you're not familiar with X-Pan, X-Pan was a camera that Hasselblad made years ago that essentially used a 35mm film, but it would project the medium format image circle onto it, so you had this extreme panorama. So this was really fun to do with either vertical or horizontal images, and it's also built into the crop mode, so even if you're not using the lenses, you can access that. So if I go into the settings, I'm going to tap crop modes, and I tap here to get my drop-down selection, and I'm going to select X-Pan, and we are set. This is one of my favorite modes on this camera. It is very interesting in terms of what you can do with composition. I have had a lot of fun with this. You can also do this with the X2D. It's been on the previous versions of these cameras. And if you have the X-Pan lenses, you can certainly use those as well. It adds a lot of functionality and a lot of variety as to what you can do with this camera. Oh, and one other use case is essentially you saw me connect this back to the film camera. As long as you have an adapter for the back, there are a wide range of technical cameras that are designed for medium format that you could use this back with. You could technically also use it with large format as long as you had a mask with the correct adapter for the back. So there's a lot that you can do with this, and I think this is one thing that differentiates the 907X from the X2D, among other things, but it's the ability to adapt this to pretty much the entire history of every camera Hasselblad has ever made. But this is really cool because you can think of the 907X, if you think of the X2D as like a machete, this is your Swiss Army knife. So are there any downsides to the 907X? Well, really there are two that I can think of. So the first one is there's no electronic viewfinder in this camera. Everything is done from the rear screen. This could be a problem if you shoot a lot in bright sunlight. If you're the type of shooter who goes out during the day, it's going to be a little bit difficult when you're dealing with reflections and bright light coming from the sun. Now, I haven't had too much of a problem with this. I find that the screen is really bright. I also tend to shoot in more diffuse lighting, shade, lower lighting conditions, and so I don't really shoot a lot in bright sunlight. But if you do, I think that's a reason why you would probably consider the X2D over the 907X, because it does have probably one of the best EVFs ever made. But that is a con with this camera, is it does not have a built-in EVF. It would also be cool to see Hasselblad consider something with their modular design in the future. I know on this camera we have added the ability to have that hot shoe. It would be cool to see an external EVF that we could use as an option on here, but currently that's not available, so that could be a deal breaker for some. And the second issue, because the size of the body is very small, there is no in-body image stabilization. They did not add this into this camera, so it is unstabilized. You're gonna have to use a tripod for slower shutter speed settings. Again, if you're the type of photographer who wants to shoot in low light and you want to be able to have access to in-body image stabilization, you're going to have to look at the X2D. It has some of the best in-body image stabilization I've used on anything, so it is definitely the way to go if that is a requirement for you. But just note that it's not on the 907X. Now, as far as alternatives for the 907X, I can't really think of any other than possibly the X2D. Now, the X2D is a more traditional camera design. It's going to function like pretty much every camera that you're used to out there. And that's one of the things that I love about the 907X. You have this modular formula that you can highly customize. And the form factor is so cool and it's so small. It plays into Hasselblad's history. It's one of the few companies that can actually do that. And I think it's so awesome from that perspective. One of the things that I mentioned at the start of this video is I actually prefer to use this as a studio camera. Now, normally you think of a studio camera as being able to use something that's really large or even maybe even bigger than this film camera. And long lenses, things that you want to be able to use in a studio that you don't necessarily want to drag around and shoot in the field with or go on location with. But one of the things that I love about this is it is so small and so compact. I like having it as a studio camera because it doesn't take up any space. It's really awesome for that. The only reason that I don't go out a little more with this is, like I said, I like to shoot in a lot of lower lighting conditions, and the lack of IBIS is a little bit of an issue on that. But if you were willing to use a tripod, it certainly has that flexibility too. I think this camera is actually really awesome for things like street photography, for architecture, where I really don't need a tripod if I've got enough light. It has a lot of versatility to it, and that's one of the things that I absolutely love about this. I also want to say that Hasselblad has come a long way with their lenses in the last couple of years for the XCD system. The early lenses were all optically excellent, and I've enjoyed using a lot of them. I've owned several of them, but the new V lenses have taken this up another level. So not only do we have like physical controls rings on the actual lenses, we have a much nicer design, they're lighter weight, they're much faster in terms of autofocus motors. So we have the original lens optical quality, but we now have some things that make them very useful. Of course, any XCD lens will work with these, and I've had a ton of fun shooting on this. I will do some more videos on the 907X, but I would love to know what you think. Drop me a comment below if there's anything you would like me to cover in those, and I will catch you guys in the next video. Until then, later.